Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. I've just read a great book called Goliath's Curse: The History and Future of Societal Collapse by Luke Kemp. And we have Luke with us tonight on this episode. Hey Luke, how are you?
Hey Scott, very well. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Well, this book, you know, it, despite the title and despite the primary content of this opus of yours, which I happen to know took you 7 years to write, so congratulations on that, first and foremost. Um, uh, I found many elements of it far more positive and inspiring than I was expecting when I read the nature of the topic considered within the book. The idea of collapse of civilizations throughout the ages, and now the threat of global collapse because of the way the world has evolved until 2025. And, in particular, one of the early lines in your book, which I thought was quite positive, was, democracy is humanity's default political system. So I think that that would surprise a lot of people in this age of growing autocracy, growing authoritarianism, growing dictatorship, and this some extraordinary diluted attraction that so many people now have, who presumably have never read history, for the so-called strong man and the individual, all-powerful 99% of the time male figures who are emerging all throughout the world today. So I guess the first question would be that: can you still really convincingly uh, say that it is truly our default system as the human race, democracy?
Absolutely. History doesn't change just because a few strongman leaders are rising up. And we have very good evidence that throughout the Paleolithic, as we call it, the first 300,000 years of human history, we existed in small egalitarian nomadic bands. They were small bands, but they lived in far vaster, greater fluid societies. But all the evidence points towards these groups operating on the basis of democracy. Most decisions would have been taken probably by consensus or something like a majority vote. No individual had any kind of persistent ongoing power over the group. To the contrary, when one person tries to dominate the group, they tend to be fought against, what's called counter dominant strategies. This includes things like ridicule, ostracism, being kicked out of the group, or in the very worst cases, in group executions. But that was a very clear intentional choice to both maintain egalitarianism, but also to maintain, I think, the democratic quality of life as well. People by nature don't usually like being told what to do arbitrarily by others. As far as we can tell, this is the persistent form of governance that goes on until, well, pretty much the rise of the very first states, roughly 5,000 years ago. There would have been some variations, of course, and we don't have a super high resolution view of how people were conducting themselves 200,000 years ago. But given that there's no signs of large scale inequality, and given that all nomadic egalitarians tend to operate on this more democratic basis, we have a very strong reason to say that democracy is the default condition of human governance. You're definitely right that things do appear to be changing, but there's also an explanation for that. One rooted in human psychology, and one's completely compatible with democracy still being our default rule. It is what I call the darker angels of our nature. In the book, I talk about how humans are pretty decent, we're pretty egalitarian, we're good at self organizing, we're democratic. But there are certain qualities which are not evenly distributed across the population. Qualities which can be quite antisocial and not necessarily beneficial for the group. One of these is what I call the authoritarian impulse. It's very well documented in social psychology that when people feel threatened, including through economic precarity or another group being at the borders, they are more likely to shift in their values towards authoritarianism. And people who are already authoritarian are more likely to become politically mobilized and violent. Suddenly, with that single insight, you can start to explain what's happening in Hungary, in the US, and even, of course, in places like Australia and here in the UK. People feel threatened because of things like economic precarity, at least at the the specter, often manufactured, of immigrants and criminals. And that's more or less helping them shift towards more authoritarian values and becoming more accepting and obedient towards high status individuals, including the kind of strongman leader. We, as part of this body literature, also have evidence that people seem to prefer certain types of rulers when they have this authoritarian shift. Generally speaking, they prefer rulers who often have more masculine features and are taller. In short, the trope of the strongman leader taking power in a time of crisis, there's an unfortunate truth to it. But just because people do tend to do this, whether it's back in the 1920s and 30s or today, it doesn't mean that democracy is dead or decaying. Quite to the contrary, I think we can quite easily return back to our democratic roots.
So what are some of the things that people can do now to begin to fight against these clearly identifiable trends?
I think one is that in general, social movements work when you have a hero-villain framing. And this is something the authoritarians do very, very well, is if people feel threatened, they need to have some kind of symbol to work against and to work for. And authoritarians do this very well. The playbook usually is blame one particular group, whether it's immigrants, for instance, trans people, etc., whatever your culture most easily maligns. And I think that when we look at the left right now, we don't often have a very good hero-villain framing. It's often unclear what's going wrong and why, while the right has a very clear, albeit faulty and completely incorrect view of the world. I think that if we have a better framing where we can actually start to point towards here's what's going wrong, here are the people behind it, that could help to essentially move people back towards, well, basically make use of this idea they feel threatened, make use of the idea that they feel in some way unstable, but more or less pivot their anger and their frustrations towards much more both peaceful but also benevolent and useful reforms. Yeah, so for instance, I think Bernie Sanders was doing a very good job of simply saying the problem right now in the States is wealth inequality. There's a large number of people who have far too many resources. That's undermining our democracy, and it's leading to distortions in policy, including things like a lack of healthcare, which most Americans, even Republicans, actually want. They do want universal healthcare. But he had a really clear villain, a really clear hero, and a very clear story and narrative. And that's what people kind of need. And I honestly think if back in 2016, the Democratic Party hadn't sabotaged Sanders and he gets the nomination, I reckon he beats Trump. He would have cannibalized most of his voters. So many of Trump's voters have exactly the same kind of underlying narrative as Sanders voters, that they're currently represented by a bunch of corrupt elites who do not represent their interests, and the world would be a better place if they had their interests more directly represented by the common people. Sanders had a clear set of policies to actually meet that. He had a narrative, a rhetoric to meet it as well. And I think that's unfortunately what we kind of need to do, is just we need to actually lean into the hero-villain framing. And to be frank, it's not exactly hard. There's some pretty clear, identifiable, both individual and institutional villains that we can pick out. Ones who are undermining democracy and more or less destroying the lives of ordinary people. It's pretty easy to say they're the problem. We need to tax them more highly. We need to get power out of their hands and back into the hands of most people. And I think most of the people who are voting for more authoritarian causes would jump ship. Granted, there are some people who, of course, are racist, etc., but I don't think that's necessarily the key underlying current behind all this. So, in short, one of the big ones is hero-villain framing. There's also some stuff around you can actually inoculate people against authoritarianism by basically providing certain kinds of messages, certain kinds of information. Same when it comes to disinformation, misinformation. If you basically provide them with good, truthful evidence beforehand and basically debunk the myths before they're exposed to them, they're less likely to become infected by it. So there's a couple of different ways, but I think the big one that we can do at scale at this stage is trying to create a new narrative which basically capitalizes upon people's need to think of the world as being a dangerous place right now. And saying, yes, it is in some ways. It's not necessarily violent dangerous. The problem is not immigrants. The problem is not necessarily criminals coming up to your doorstep. The problem is you're living a much more economically precarious life because the system is stacked against you. And the best way out of that is democracy.
Well, I mean, politics is often presented as a flat spectrum from far left to far right, but I think the real world is much more spherical or circular in nature, whereby the left very quickly becomes the extreme right. It's much more of a circle, and the extreme right can just as easily be communist and socialist. The interests, economically speaking, and elsewhere are really similar. A lot of all of this, of course, stems from the way in which humans have decided to organize ourselves politically. This thing that we all refer to as the nation state. And it's gone through many permutations throughout the years, but the current system, we can trace it back, with a lot of caveats, but essentially to the mid 1600s, the treaties of Westphalia, etc., where the modern nation state system that we still have is born. There's a lengthy paragraph. I was going to read it, but it's too long. But near the end of your book, you go through all the differences between the reality today and the reality of several hundred years ago, and they're fundamental at every single level. And I always use exactly that same reasoning with people when I'm trying to convince them that we need to go to the next stage of our political evolution going forwards rather than going backwards. So every single thing in society is different today than it was in 1648 when the 30 Years' War ended in Europe. I mean, whether it's the products we buy, whether farming techniques, whatever, banking, transportation systems, you name it, information, it's all completely different, except for the way in which essentially we have decided to organize ourselves politically in the nation state. Nation state has brought us immensely good things in many ways, but it is also the vehicle through which some of our darkest sides are most efficiently expressed. Nationalism, hatred of the other, blind patriotism, and the very nature of the nation state, by having an electoral system that's meant to be premised on democracy, tends, if you look at history, as you have very, very thoroughly, it's a certain type of psychological makeup that tends to be a person that attempts to take control of a democratic society by being elected. Most people don't really want to be a leader because they don't have those particular psychological tendencies. So by its very nature, one could argue the system is structurally flawed because you don't get somebody who doesn't want power taking power. You talked a lot about, I think it's called sortition, the idea of selecting political. Is that the right word? Sortition? Yeah.
Correct.
Selecting
Sortition or
political.
lottery, one can say.
Yeah, or like a jury system, basically a random
Exactly.
lottery system of putting everyone's name goes in a hat. Some independent person pulls it out, and that person becomes leader for a while. And there are other methods too to hopefully get. We all know that absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So how do we get people within a democratic system to put their names forward as potential leaders and decision makers who are really very reluctant to do so because they don't actually want power, because they don't psychologically need power in order to feel fulfilled in life? Because, I mean, right now we could go on for hours just listing the amount of people in the world today that are in positions of political power because of their psychological makeup.
It's worthwhile pausing very briefly on who is pursuing power and why. I mentioned this idea of the darker angels of nature with the authoritarian impulse, our tendency to shift towards the right, the authoritarian right, when feeling threatened. That is one of the darker angels, but there's three others I talk about in the book. Another is status competition through domination. Everyone wants status, everyone wants to be desired, admired, respected, loved. Very few people are willing to pursue that and to take it through force, through violence, intimidation, bullying. There are some people, and they're not exactly not exactly a large part of the population. It's not evenly distributed. It tends to be overwhelmingly men, and it tends to be people who are higher in what's called the dark triad, which is the second darker angel by nature. The dark triad is a set of antisocial personality traits, including narcissism, an overinflated sense of ego, Machiavellianism, a tendency to treat people as means to an end, and last but not least, psychopathy, callousness, lack of empathy and remorse. And the last darker angel is power corrupting. You mentioned Lord Acton's phrase that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we actually have pretty good evidence from both social psychology and neurology now that power does tend to corrupt. People who get into positions of power are more likely to cheat both in games and on both in games and on their spouses. They have less empathy, less compassion. They tend to overinflate their abilities compared to others. They tend to have less risk aversion, and their brains even change as well. We have studies where basically people put in a brain scanner. They're primed to think of themselves being in a position of power, and you see that their mirroring neurons tend to become inhibited. Mirroring is when we tend to copy each other's body language as a way to basically build rapport, to build empathy. People in power essentially don't do that as often. Their very neurological infrastructure to do so is compromised. But once you get all three of those happening, it becomes quite clear that the people who are willing to take power very early on would have been people who are more likely to use violence to do so and to dedicate their entire lives in the pursuit of high status positions. And most people, frankly, don't want to do that. I hate the idea of going into politics because I like spending time with friends and family. I don't want to spend my entire time negotiating with people who I think often don't have good faith intentions, and I don't like the idea of compromising my morals either. And I think most people are like that as well. But unfortunately, roughly 5,000 years ago, and I think this actually well precedes the Treaty of Westphalia and the nation state, we had the rise of the very first, what we just call simply states, sets of centralized institutions which impose rules upon a territorially confined population and extract resources from them. And while the nation state is a bit of an evolution of that in some ways, it's a coating of sovereignty for international law, and there's a much bigger emphasis upon we have a shared nation status, which most empires didn't necessarily have. They would have a notion of citizen versus non-citizen, barbarian versus civilization, but not necessarily that we all have one shared origin and ethnicity, as we often emphasize today in nation states. But apart from that, the actual architecture of how we rule and who's selected to rule hasn't changed that much realistically. It's still primarily dominant status seekers who tend to get into power. And as you said, it's pretty easy to go for a roll call of those both for history and today. The beauty of sortition and lottery, which it's worth noting is what the Greeks equated with democracy. The ancient Greeks actually would have equated voting with aristocracy and oligarchy. The good thing about sortition and lottery is you're picking people at random. Suddenly, the selection mechanism changes. You're not picking for people who are the best at negotiating, violence, or intimidation. You're not even picking for the people who want power and who want to have status. You're just picking at random. And that means you're less likely to have an overrepresentation of people who are psychopaths, for instance, which we do tend to have today in parliaments and in boardrooms. On top of that, people are only in power for a very short period of time for one particular policy matter. In other words, it's pretty unlikely they're going to get corrupted by power. And last but not least, this really leans into the power of deliberation. In all these kind of what we call open democratic or deliberative democratic systems, it involves people getting together in a group, you select them at random, and then you have them debate. You have them exchange information, you have them deliberate, as we say. If one goes to Australian Parliament or Congress, there's one thing you notice, and that's that politicians don't tend to change their mind very frequently. I was speaking to a US congressman who was also involved with the World Trade Organization, which is kind of often involves a group of judges deliberating. And he said the refreshing thing about the WTO was that the judges actually would change their mind. They were involved in genuine deliberation, while in Congress, he did not see much deliberation at all. He'd have the occasional miraculous change of heart, usually on topics that mattered far less and didn't have money involved. But in general, people had a party line they had to toe, they had sponsors they had to appease, and hence there was no real deliberation. In this case, when you have a random selection of citizens just simply debating a topic which may matter to them or may not, they're much more likely to deliberate and change their minds. And we have evidence that people do this all the time, and that when you do these deliberative democratic experiments, people tend to become more open to changing their mind and their opinions. They also tend to become less polarized. You have so many cases of Democrats and Republicans coming into a room, being at each other's throats, and leaving, at the very least, respecting each other and potentially even being friends. So, in many ways, what we're doing with sortition and lottery, this kind of more intense form of democracy, is moving away from the darker ages of our nature and leaning into the brighter side of our nature.
Right. Well, one of the biggest slur words you can say today in certain circles is calling someone a globalist, right? And from that, I'm a very proud globalist, by the way. Saying that to somebody um, as a slur now is really indicative of this, this inward-looking nationalistic kind of, delusional sense that my country is the greatest, our people are the best, our religion is dominant over all others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Extrapolating from that, of course, is this incredible fear, particularly by some very big names in the right-wing world these days, um, that fear more than anything else a world government, right? The world government equals either Satan or Antichrist or some other evil force that must be fought against with the most vigor possible. Um, Conversely, there are those who believe that unless we have a unified system of global governance that has sufficient power to do what's necessary in order to preserve our species and our planet, we have no chance. Um, and we obviously fall in that latter camp, and I write books about that and try to make it as practical as possible how you would actually go about doing that. One of the obstacles we obviously come up against in terms of arguments against it is the danger of a global despot emerging, right? So one of the alternative ways to have, if there's even a leadership entity required, which is another debate, if you're going to have it, why not base it on what Uruguay tried in the 1950s, which was a rotating presidency to prevent the emergence of yet another dictator, or what Switzerland has today, which is a rotating presidency as well, where the presidency is shifted once a year, to the point where if you ask a random, I mean, I lived in Switzerland many years. If you ask a random person on the street who's president now, a lot of people wouldn't even know because it just shifts and they accept that these are technocrats by and large. Yes, they're members of political parties, but they're basically there to run things in a smooth and efficient fashion. So do you think we could have something along those lines? I mean, because getting to the sortition, which in principle to me sounds, ideal and perfect, perhaps tested first at a local level and then, bringing it up to higher and higher levels. The status quo actors, the powers that be, will obviously do everything in their power to prevent the emergence of such a system. I believe. So how do we get around that? And what do you see in terms of everything you learned from the 7 years you spent writing this book and your career generally? Um, is the idea of a unified humanity being governed under one law, under one global government, controlled by a world parliament, which is democratically elected, led by a rotating or multi-headed leadership entity, is that the way to go if we want to preserve human life on this planet? Or do you think some completely different world is more likely to push things in the right direction?
Some form of global governance to address global problems. Of course, it's essentially that simple. You want to match your level of governance to the level of problem you're trying to face. And that doesn't mean it has to have complete power over all elements of life. Far from it. We often talk about this idea of subsidiarity, which actually comes from the Roman Catholic Church, but is more or less enshrined in the EU and others today. It's the idea of you take governance decisions at the lowest level possible. And that means, lots of things like waste collection, for instance, we do at the local level. But there are some things, like, say, for instance, addressing climate change or nuclear weapons, which are going to require a more international or global bent. And there's nothing particularly wrong about that. So, this idea that you have to essentially cluster all governance, all decision making power into that one body, I think is wrong and flawed. You just have to have a approach of subsidiarity to the world. I mean, one thing I always find about this notion of global elite quite funny is that often when it's discussed, it's usually referring to a couple of university professors, people working in the European Commission, etc., etc. And having friends who work in the European Commission and still live in share houses, for instance, or university professors and struggle to pay the bills, I find it very funny for that group to be called an elite. And of course, let's face it, this is just a distracting term. When we use elite in archaeology and history, it has a very precise meaning. It's basically the top 1% or so of decision makers and wealth holders in the world or in a particular society. And in this case, the globalist elite don't really exist. There are some people, of course, who are involved with global institutions and have an immense amount of power and money. People like Bill Gates, for instance. But by and large, it's not what people think it is. And if you're looking at the global elite, it's usually people using the term globalist and global elite. It's usually people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk. So it's worthwhile just, I think pivoting that language where we can as well. How will one do this? I mean, there's different models out there. One of the most popular has been this idea of having some kind of democratic federalism. So essentially, you try to more or less have different clusters of like assemblies, councils, juries, etc. And then they can feed up either rotating representatives or some other kind of, even like a random selection within that group up to the next level. You could do it like that. You could have this kind of federalist model, and there's a lot of value to that. You could say, for instance, literally just have a model where you have sortition across the entire world into kind of global citizen assemblies or juries on particular matters like climate change. And if you wanted to make it more robust, you could like combine that with, you'd have both an assembly, a jury, and you have to have some kind of like big digital deliberation and vote as well. And there's a lot of big digital tools that are being pioneered now. Audrey Tang, one of my favorite thinkers in the space, talks a lot about this and has the idea of plurality, which is basically how do we use digital technologies to harness and make use of the pluralism of opinions and perspectives out there, which actually are all different sources of information. They're actually really useful in terms of reaching better decisions. They're not necessarily a barrier or a puzzle to overcome. In short, I think there's different ways of doing this. You could take the much more sortition heavy approach. You could take the kind of democratic federalism approach. I think one thing to bear in mind is that when you have a structure, you can build in accountability and democratic safeguards. When you don't have a structure, it's more likely that simply might equals right. The powerful will rule. And while we didn't have a global government from 1990 until, well, basically today, the US has been the de facto superpower. They've crafted most of international institutions, have had an incredible amount of unequal power, particularly when it comes to, say, for instance, trade deals. And while people are terrified of this idea of, everyone living under one law, we already kind of do. There's a reason why you can very easily move capital between even China and the US, because they have very similar property rights. Basically, every single country has a whole bunch of property rights based upon either New York state law or British common law, one of the two. And guess the reason why those two are the ones which tend to rule? Because they're the two dominant military powers. So it's kind of a pick your poison. Do you want to have our international institutions, legal frameworks, etc., imposed by the dominant military power of the time? Or do you want to have a system where all of us share power and have equal power to determine what kind of global rules, laws we're being enmeshed within? I'd definitely pick the latter, and I think almost everyone would actually. And that's ultimately the real choice we face, not a choice between either the nation state versus big, ugly, global Leviathan. That's always been an illusion used to justify having authoritarianism at home.
Right, right. Well, there's a big move now to create a sort of parliamentary assembly that would be a parallel body to the General Assembly, right? So, comprised either of members of national parliaments or maybe even selected separately in a separate election. And there's a lot of movement underway internationally, which gets almost no attention in the media. Everything, all the distractions get attention, but the real work that people are doing behind the scenes are moving forward. And then, the obvious thing which does get attention, the European Union. I mean, if you look at it historically, it's one of the most remarkable developments ever. Like countries that have fought, killed each other for centuries, more millennia, have somehow found a way forward. So, despite its flaws, despite its weaknesses, despite this and that, at the macro level, it's something that we can all look to as inspirational. And there's probably more unity amongst African countries within the African Union context than ever before. There's probably more unity in Asia than ever before. There's probably there's a lot more unity happening. But that doesn't, it's not when it bleeds, it leads sort of scenario. It's just peaceful, boring meetings of people actually getting along and seeing each other as humans rather than as specific citizens of a nation state. But we're still presented with this problem, which is that most people, most of the time, may in their heart say, yes, of course, I want to be a citizen of the world. I want to be a world citizen. But when presented with the very real prospect of it, they're afraid of losing what they have. The whole construct is, oh, I have to sacrifice everything in order to become that world citizen person. And our perspective, of course, is no, you're not. It's like the layers of an onion. You're not removing layers of the onion. You're just adding another layer. So, just as you can be a sister and a mother and a cousin and an auntie all at the same time and many other identities, you can also be all of those things and a world citizen. And it's that thing that ties us all together, our shared humanity, that is, by any logical measure, it has to be the way that we move forward as a species, I believe, on a single solitary planet, stuck off in the corner of some distant universe, the only source of life in the 2 trillion galaxies that we know of, and we're on the verge of blowing each other up. I mean, it's just beyond belief. And I mean, you did mention this rather negative, well, that's not negative, but depressing fact that 99.9% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct, and there's no reason to believe that Homo sapiens should not also become a member of that group. That would be something I would rather postpone as long as possible. But one of the really scary facts that you put in your book, you do an analysis of all of these doomsday scenarios that different writers and thinkers have put together, and you did an averaging out, and you found that 1 out of 3 predictions says that global collapse will occur by the year 2100, 75 years from now. 1 in 3 chance. So there's almost nothing in life you would do that was risky that had a 1 in 3 chance, right? I mean, you're not going to go skiing if there's a 1 in 3 chance that you're going to die. You're not going to drive your car if there's a 1 in 3 chance of you're going to have an accident. So, I mean, if the facts are if those are even close to true, we are all just hurtling down this hillside blindly, just consuming whatever we can and having as much hedonistic fantasies as we can make come true before the whole thing just falls apart. And I mean, that's just like the most depressing scenario. How do we really go about concretely avoiding that fate and really, trying to positively look at the current contemporary political reality as simply this end phase of a certain period of time at which all things go toxic before the new thing can be built, which is much more in the direction of a unified human race, a common understanding, collaboration, peace, harmony, love, all the good things. So how do we, in the end, I know you have a whole bunch of recommendations about what we can do, including my favorite of all, which I just have to mention now, which is don't be a dick. So just don't be a dick, people. Look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself not to be a dick tomorrow, and make it a lifelong quest. But what can we do now, like in real terms? Like, what do you say to, let's just say, um, somebody living in a rural area in Australia, which has been comparatively immune to the forces that are affecting both the UK where you are, the country where I was born, the United States, a number of others throughout the world. It's still affected, very much so, but it's not as affected. So hopefully we'll have a similar scenario to the global financial crisis, which somehow passed us by more or less, affected everybody else. But what do you say to whatever, somebody that lives in a small town in like Bendigo in the state of Victoria, or Wagga Wagga or whatever, who's very finding it very difficult to make ends meet, even in the world's richest or virtually richest country in the world? How can you get through to those people and everyone else that looking towards something bigger, something better, something where we are truly sharing this planet with our fellow humans is infinitely better than the reality that we're facing today?
If I was talking to that farmer in Bendigo or a cleaner back in Bega where I grew up, I'd probably say something along the lines of, I know living is tough right now. It's hard to even just pay the bills, that you don't know if you can rely upon your government to be there for you if things go wrong, whether you're sick or you lose your job. And even worse, tomorrow there could be a nuclear war. There's nothing you can do about it, and your life could be absolutely shattered. And the commonality behind both of those is big, concentrated, unaccountable power. That's not your fault, but the solution to both is getting more power yourself. And not just you, but everyone. The solution to both is democracy. If you want to have an Australian system which takes care of its citizens, and one where everyone can afford a house, then you really just have to return back to democracy. And likewise, if we want to make sure that we don't have a nuclear war tomorrow, then it's once again easily a return to democracy is the key answer here. Because when you look at it, most of these things, when it comes down to it, when you look at the surveys, people do want to have an abolition of nuclear weapons. There's strong majorities for that, even in places like the United States and in Israel. And likewise, you talk to most Australian citizens, just a simple, let's take the majority opinion, you would have pretty big reforms, particularly in terms of the housing market and things like negative gearing right now. The problem is, in Australian Parliament, most politicians have pretty big property portfolios, and in both Russia and the US, there's very powerful generals who often go to work in arms manufacturers afterwards, very powerful politicians who work in arms manufacturers afterwards, and arms manufacturers, big ones like Raytheon, Boeing, etc., who have an incredible vested interest in making sure that the nuclear arsenal's maintained, upgraded, and sometimes even expanded. Again, that's not the fault of the average citizen at all, but the solution to both is actually putting more power back into the hands of the average citizen. So rather than seeing these as being almost kind of separate intention problems, how do I pay my bills? How do I take care of my family? I don't have time to think about the nuclear weapons and climate change. Instead, we can think about these as being manifestations of the same underlying problem. One, more speculative, lower probability, but much more devastating, and the other, a day-to-day reality, but nonetheless, both require the same solution. And in the book, I go through a whole bunch of these solutions. And in some ways, I break these up in two baskets. One is simply, what are the actual particular interventions, the policies we can take to reduce existential risk today? And when I say existential risk, I'm referring to the risk of an event which either results in global societal collapse or, at the very worst, human extinction. But we're basically talking about the threat to the existence of an object, and the object in this case is either humanity, Homo sapiens, our species, or the globalized, industrialized world we live in. But either way, something that destroys one of those two. And how do we reduce existential risk today? It's often pretty simple. It's things like, of course, abolishing nuclear weapons. If you wanted to have a medium step towards that, then right now you could easily reduce nuclear weapons to what people would call a minimum deterrence, essentially enough to deter other countries from trying to invade you. It would stop great power war, which is usually the big kind of moral justification for nuclear weapons is, at the very least, they stop us from having World War III. Russia is less likely to go to war with the US because they have nukes. I don't necessarily believe that, but nonetheless, let's throw these people a bone. If you want to have minimum deterrence, you probably only need roughly somewhere between 100 to 300 nuclear weapons. Right now, Russia has roughly 4,000 and the US has roughly 3,500. Suddenly, they can both reduce their stockpiles, but to roughly a tenth of what they currently own and still maintain deterrence. Take that as an initial step towards eventually having abolition. Climate change, we already know what we need to do. There's been very well documented what are called pathways to decarbonization, basically roadmaps, plans for how countries, every major economy can reach net zero emissions. And it includes pretty obvious stuff like electrifying transport, having a pretty strong carbon pricing system, one that actually feeds the proceeds back to the working class, and having a lot more energy efficiency measures, which usually benefit everyone. And in general, across most of our global ecological problems, the very easiest solution is just to make the economy more honest. When you're doing things like putting in place a carbon pricing system, all you're really doing is internalizing the costs that industry is imposing upon the population. People die every year due to carbon pollution already, roughly 9 to 12 million of them. Basically, fossil fuel companies are killing people and not paying for it. They're basically causing millions of people to be sick, not go to work, and they're not paying for that either. When you do things like a carbon price, all you're doing is suddenly making industry pay for it. You're making the costs there in the actual price. And we should be doing this across the board for all big social and environmental risks and problems and costs and damages caused by industry. That should be reflected in the price. That's just making an honest economy. And if you did that, the world would change dramatically, very, very quickly, and we'd have far less existential risk. So that's a small taste of some of the things we can do to reduce existential risk. Of course, people will immediately say, well, the problem is that we can't do things like abolish nuclear weapons or have strong carbon prices in a world of big competing powers. And this is where I think you have to go back towards changing the way in which we select rulers and the change in the way in which we essentially craft power in our societies. I think one of the big problems we've had throughout history is we've tried to concentrate different forms of power into a small number of individuals. In the book, I talk about different forms of power. You can have the ability to control decision-making, political power, the ability to control resources that others depend on, economic power, the ability to control lethal force and violence, violent power, or the ability to control the information people rely upon, information power. And that could be an administration, a bureaucracy, or even a church. And the problem is that each of those tend to get clustered together. Throughout history, your king has usually also been the commander-in-chief as well. They've often been a religious figure on top of that. And, of course, they tend to be incredibly rich. That's one of the key incentives to become a king in the first place. And today, we see a very similar thing. Elon Musk isn't just incredibly rich, he's also trying to get himself involved in elections. He was, of course, at some stage the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge. And on top of that, he seems to be really keen on controlling information, including through things like buying Twitter. And we see the same thing happening with Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos isn't just very rich, he makes huge campaign donations. He was there at Trump's inauguration. And additionally, he owns Twitch, Audible, and the Washington Post. These are people who are trying to grab all the different forms of power and bring them together. And what we need to do in the long term is to level all those sources of power. So when it comes to economic power, we need to have things like wealth taxes, and I think just cap wealth at $10 million. There's really no reason anyone needs anything more than that. And frankly, anything more than that tends to lead to people who try to fuck up our democracies. Just instead, give them a sticker that says, you want capitalism, congratulations, here is your status. Good work, champ. That's all we really need. That's often all they really want is the status. There's a great quote from a guy, Harold Huntington, back in the 1920s, who was one of the kind of billionaires of his age. He had wealth, I think, of roughly 520 million. He was an oil baron. And he essentially says that anyone who earns $200,000 is, for all intents and purposes, living as good a life as me. Everything beyond that is just keeping score. There's no reason we should let people keep score at the cost of burning the world. That's fucking stupid. Alongside that, we know pretty well how to level political power, and we've already discussed it. Having things like more sortition based citizens' assemblies and juries, and using them not just in parliaments and in governments, but also in the private sector as well. I've always found it pretty bizarre that democracy, for some reason, is only something we refer to when it comes to the public. If you vote every 4 years, but you're working 9 to 5 in a mini authoritarian dictatorship, is it really a democracy that you're living in? I don't think so personally. Democracy is something that is practiced across all systems. And we should start having more companies which are both worker owned and kind of worker directed, and also ones which probably do have citizens' juries sitting alongside the board as well. If, say, for instance, there was a group of randomly allocated citizens in Exxon during the 1970s, when Exxon essentially did its own modeling about climate change. It understood the damages it was causing, it understood how bad climate change could get, and it decided to intentionally bury the information and spend tens of millions of dollars to mislead citizens, to run misinformation, disinformation campaigns, to lie about the science of climate change. If there was that group of citizens there, I'm pretty doubtful they would have said, yeah, that's a good idea, Exxon. Go ahead, do that. And I think there's a whole bunch of different corporate scandals throughout history where if you had a small group of citizens being involved, that shit wouldn't have gone down. So I see this as being another key one is democratization. But across the board, it's basically just leveling power. And one way of leveling power is also thinking about your own personal conduct, which is where we come to don't be a dick. And yeah, don't be a dick is in many ways pretty simple. So I do frame it as don't work for arms manufacturers, AI labs, and fossil fuel companies, companies you know who are directly contributing to the destruction of the world and to the potential risk of existential collapse. Additionally, don't be a Goliath, as I call it, in your own conduct. Don't try to dominate other people. Don't give in to the darker angels of your nature. If you do find yourself in a position where you have a lot of power clustered into yourself, try to distribute it where you can. Try to be democratic in all your actions. And last but not least, I think we tend to live in a culture where there's a lot of emphasis upon optimization, upon doing the best you can in all facets of life. To even sometimes people will apply this to morality, try to maximize your good impact in the world. But I'm also interested in people just trying to make sure that they are kind to the extent that they minimize damage they could potentially do. There's a lot of people who are just trying to make the most money possible, do the most good, but they don't think about how this could all go wrong and how their pursuit of ever greater power, wealth, status, or even doing good could potentially result in great harm to others. And don't be a dick is just a reminder of don't do really bad things. That's like the baseline of everything. So if you have a situation where you can maximize, but you're probably going to cause a huge amount of damage to people, don't be a dick. Don't do it. Just hold yourself to a higher standard. And
Sometimes easier said than done, unfortunately.
it is unfortunately, but nonetheless, it's worth striving for.
I totally agree. It raises this issue that we constantly come up against. When we're discussing the idea of a global polity and world citizenship where we all have the same passport, et cetera, et cetera. Ancient ideas, right? Goes back to Socrates and before. And yet we haven't been able to do it, and you deal a little bit with a similar issue by isolating it down to our psychological makeup as humans, right? Operating in a modern world with a very ancient brain, and being triggered to either fight or fight or flight, et cetera, et cetera. And there are these psychological obstacles, and we're doing a project now that's really trying to narrow them down and find techniques whereby an ordinary normal person of a normal income and a normal education level who's super reluctant to do it because of all the fear-oriented responses to this idea of embracing the all instead of just embracing, our own kind, and how you can actually go through that. Because for most people, it really is sort of an evolutionary process. I mean, I think we're all born in this state of there is no division between me and the mother, right? For me and anything in the world for I think a year or 18 months. There's no physical capacity of the brain to even distinguish between oneself and everything else that is. And then suddenly you become this individual and it's me and everything else. And then you spend your entire life, if you pursue this quest, to come back to where you started from, which was, merging with everything that exists and seeing the similarities and things rather than the differences, and basing your, decisions on that. And so from a perspective of 193 member nation states of the UN, evolving into something that's more unified in its approach, we can identify all sorts of components of that. You'll probably easily guess the answer I get from most people all around the world. Doesn't matter where. I've worked everywhere. I've spent thousands of hours discussing this idea with people from every single culture in the world, every religion, every region, you name it. What's the most common response I get from people? It's never going to happen until aliens visit Earth. Right? Literally.
It's always the aliens. Always the aliens.
It's always the aliens. And as somebody who doesn't really believe in aliens, I mean, I guess statistically the chances are not zero that they're there. I'm not expecting them to come anytime soon. So what's the de facto alien? It's clearly something like climate change or nuclear weapons or something that has comprehensive capacity to not just affect everybody, but ultimately to, wipe us all out. So I think that in a way, I work in the field of climate change very extensively. It's like being served to us on a silver platter, like every day almost. Look how bad it is, guys. Here's your chance to unify. And look what's happening as a result. We're not unifying. In fact, we're going way back into the gray matter of the deepest, darkest recesses of our brain, saying, oh no, we can't do that. It's just not going to work. It's going to be, too threatening. So how do we, do you know any mysterious de facto aliens that we're not spending enough attention on besides climate change and nuclear weapons that might get us there? Because I think all the components are there. Humans have traveled further and to more places now than ever before at the individual level, right? Everyone everywhere has had Chinese food at least once. Everywhere has had Italian food at least once. We've listened to music from all around the world. We've seen the attributes of every major religion on our TV screens. We share the same streaming services. We all have either Samsung or iPhone. You name it. Like what we share and what we're seeing and what we're doing is so global in orientation and so like humanist in orientation in so many ways. And even then, so many of us, continue to retreat back and somehow delude ourselves into thinking that our people are the best. Our nation is the only one that really gets it, and that's why I'm sticking with it till the bitter end. And I'm a true patriot, and I will die for my country. That kind of mentality is still so prevalent. And how do we get people to climb higher on the ladder of human consciousness or whatever you want to call it, whereby the higher they climb, the more you see, and the more you also hopefully also see that, that guy over there, he's got a family too. He gets hungry too if he hasn't eaten for 12 hours. He needs to go to bed every night for 8 hours, et cetera, et cetera. The nation state and its attributes pre-program us almost to focus on difference. Whether it's language or religion or skin color or whatever it may be. Remember Bob Marley famously said, he made reference to the fact that, the quest is to judge people more by the color of their eyes than the color of their skin, things like that. We don't do eyes, but we certainly still do skin, right? For some absurd reason. But how do we get, that segment of society, which is still considerable, to including now, in the UK, very considerable, to again re-embrace without having to go through the trauma of a World War II or equivalent that led to the international legal order that we had since 1945. How can we get to our next phase of political evolution without a war necessitating us finally drawing on our higher selves?
Hmm. Or the trauma of a visit from aliens unexpectedly.
That's right. That's right. Because remember, Stephen Hawking famously said, there's all these people in the world that really want aliens to come. And he said, you do not want aliens to come, because if they're coming here, they're coming to conquer and extract. That's the only reason they're coming. They're not coming to party down, or share wisdom and knowledge and technology. They're just coming to extract and take over. So we kind of have to hope they don't come.
Yeah, I frankly don't know. I mean, on the one hand, Hawking was basing this upon the notion that aliens would be kind of similar to conquistadors meeting the New World. They're primarily out there on behalf of Spain, basically, to get resources. I'm, I guess the one thing that gives me hope is I feel that if a society, a species, is capable of reaching the level of intergalactic space exploration without destroying themselves, they've probably gotten actually pretty good at being kind, cooperative, etc., potentially beyond their own species. Nonetheless, the way I like to think about this is less in terms of taking a step into the unknown or evolving. Instead, like with democracy, I like to think of this as just returning back to our roots. So not only is democracy our default condition, in many ways, interconnectivity, even interdependence, having something close to a globalized world, that's also our default. When you look at human species for the first 300,000 years, while we often are in these kind of small groups of roughly kind of between 40 to a couple hundred people, we're constantly moving between them. So people may have evolved in small groups, but not small societies. We evolved in very big societies, actually. The average individual probably over the space of their lifetime knew thousands and thousands of people because they were constantly moving across different groups. And those groups weren't just these kind of ragtag, inward-focused, tribalistic groups of people who were families. Instead, even amongst modern-day nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers, less than 10% usually are closely blood-related. And you often have people speaking entirely different languages and coming from entirely different regions. And 120,000 years ago, we have evidence that these big societies of kind of fluidly moving people resulted in shared lithic stone tools, musical instruments, genetics, culture, all the way from the east coast to the west coast of Africa. And I call these fluid civilizations. And you see this in other parts of the world as well. So there's the Aurignacian culture starting roughly 41,000 years ago, which stretched all the way from Siberia to Spain. And you see shared ways of doing cave art, shared ways of having figurines, for instance, shared ways of doing stone tools. Likewise, North America as well had the Clovis culture, which basically covered almost all of the United States, which they all used very similar arrowheads and very similar cutting tools. Once again, because people were moving across groups, they were sharing, they were cooperating, and as far as we can tell, they could do so because they had pretty low rates of violence. It's really difficult to have intensive trade because and with high rates of violence, because no one wants to trade across a war zone usually. But all the evidence points towards, for most of human history, us having probably something between a kind of 1 to 2% rate of lethal violence. In other words, for every 100 people, 1 or 2 die at the hands of another individual. And that's about the same, if not slightly lower than the modern world. So, in short, the world we kind of want to move towards was in some ways the world we had for a long period of time. How do we re-achieve that? One funny thing is that people who tend to be much more xenophobic, they also tend to have far less exposure to other races. There's a very big difference between having Chinese food versus actually knowing lots of Chinese people having them in your neighborhood. And there tends to be this really big difference between kind of urban and rural areas, in particular when it comes to xenophobia, with rural areas often being more xenophobic. And that's often just because they don't have as much exposure. Even if you look at the 1950s and 60s, one of the key institutions that actually started to make the first moves on civil rights and was actually much more multicultural was, weirdly enough, the US military. because they had a large number of African Americans serving the military who had to serve alongside whites, and they kind of realized we're actually pretty similar. When it comes down to it, we have very similar humor, we can get along really well, we can save each other's lives. There's not a big difference here. And for me personally, that's also been the case as well. I've lived in places like Germany, the US, I've traveled many places as well. And you just come to a very quick conclusion of there's both assholes and there's plenty of kind, decent, good people I can be friends with across cultures. There's people in Australia who I fucking hate. There's plenty of Australians I love. And that's exactly the same in the US as well. So I think exposure could be part of it. The difficulty here, of course, is that exposure requires lots of movement. It often requires money. It requires transport emissions. But I think exposure is definitely going to be part of it. I think another part of it's going to be just simply, once again, having these more democratic systems, and particularly systems of sortition, where you're probably going to be put into a jury with people of different ethnicities and backgrounds. I think that'll help to depolarize people and to basically help to get people used to the idea of other people also approach these things in good faith. They can come from different cultures and backgrounds. There's no need to think of this as inferior or superior necessarily. And I think we've already covered it with the other ones, which is often when people grasp this idea of we're superior and the other is the enemy, it's because they're in a situation where they feel under threat and they kind of need something like an enemy. And we're lucky enough to live in a world where there just are pretty bad actors we can point towards. But it's not usually foreigners, it's usually very large, unaccountable concentrations of power. And granted, sometimes it is in foreign countries. I don't trust the Russian military, but I also don't really trust most US weapons manufacturers. And I think once we start to point towards the real common enemy that most of us have, suddenly it starts to push our energy and our focus away from what divides us and instead actually brings us together. And you see this once again when it comes to history. The big successful union movements back in the 1930s and 40s in the US, the union organizers made a really concerted effort to basically get white workers and non-white workers to work together, but always with the goal in mind of the real problem here is the boss is taking most of the money and is running really, really bad conditions for all of us. And as soon as they realized they had that shared class interest, suddenly the racial divide actually started disappearing pretty quick once they realized who the real enemy was. So I think there's multiple different things we can do: exposure, democratization, and having this change in narrative to really recognize both our shared interests and what the problem is. And I think the cluster of things could help move us towards a more globalized world and, importantly, move us back towards our true human nature.
And I think also, I mean, having some sort of positive vision about what awaits us,
Yeah,
what to
exactly.
look, how does it fundamentally look different than what today looks like in terms of how you go through life? If you can
Yeah.
have that, whether you call it utopian or not, but some sort of different, improved vision of a shared future. I don't know. Have you ever seen the movie Code 46? It didn't
No.
go very far. Well, you're gonna love it, I think.
Okay.
So go look up Code 46. I don't even
Code
remember the year.
46.
Maybe 1998 or around there. Tim
Hmm.
Robbins is in it, the actor, and
Okay.
Om Puri is in it, if you know that guy,
Yeah, of
um,
course.
who died recently. Anyway,
Oh, no, really? Okay.
the reason I mention it and why I tell everybody about it is that I think unless we do change. This is the most likely near future scenario that awaits us all should we be lucky enough to avoid nuclear war. So this is a world in which basically the wealthy have isolated themselves into essentially city states. So like a return to Sparta with this
Hmm.
area called Alfuera, and it's a mishmash of languages. The global language is a mixture of Hindi and Urdu and Chinese and
Hmm.
English and French. It's great the way that, and you can just tell. I mean, I speak a lot of those, but you can. It's really interesting. Anyway, you have to have this
Hmm.
thing called cover in order to get into one of the city states, right? And so the whole thing is about the corrupt use of cover to get people in and out of these areas. But it really,
Hmm.
and being out, the worst thing that can happen to you is to be banished to Alfuera, to the outside,
Hmm.
and that's where 95, 98, 99% of the, human human population lives is afuera.
Mhm.
And even inside these city states, it's not as luxury as you would think. It's not as great, you know? So to me, that's the way we're tending. You know, I mean, it's just de facto now. It's not official, but we already have these isolated areas of immense opulence and wealth, and a lot of bad stuff in between the next one. And
Yeah,
then, and it's formalized, but it's not written down. But that is the way, you know, it's going. And I think, you know, you mentioned the 10 million, you know, the limit of the limitarian limit. I mean, I think stuff like that also needs to be much higher on the political agendas of the
agreed.
world. And, you know, let the 3,046 billionaires justify why they should be able to have that level of capital. And, you know, 99+% of the human race is not a millionaire yet. So you have a pretty significant, you know, 1 million, not 10, but a pretty significant class base from which to launch a global change movement. And as we know, you know, 3.5, what is it, 3.5% of people on the street on any given day shooting for the same aim is very likely to succeed in whatever their objective is, measured throughout history. In that famous book, I can't remember the authors, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking
Erica
about.
Chenoweth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
yeah.
So I guess the final question for today, like, you know, knowing all that you know in incredible detail, and again, congratulations on an amazing book that is
Thank you.
really, really worth reading. Everyone on planet Earth should read this book. It's absolutely fantastic. Um, but you really delve into so many different cultures and historical epochs, and you know, show really the, to use my Southern California language, the gnarly side of humanity throughout the
I
ages,
love that.
right? But also the good side. But so, you know, how do you, as an individual academic and writer and author and man and resident of the United Kingdom and all of that, uh, Aussie brought up, how do you move forward in the world? I mean, what keeps you sane and happy and you know, jolly like you are, knowing all of the stuff that could go wrong?
A lot of it is the people I'm around. You know, having friends who are also striving to make the world a better place, who are trying to work for things like nuclear disarmament, trying to work for peace in Gaza, trying to work for reducing our emissions, and seeing how brilliant, passionate, sharp these people are and how grounded they are. That gives me a lot of hope. And a lot of this is just an extension of what the book gave me, which was, I think, a more accurate depiction of what people are really like. And that's most people are pretty decent, kind, altruistic, egalitarian. And while the book made me more pessimistic about the future, I think things do look pretty grim if we can't, say, for instance, get ourselves out of arms races and races for resources and status. When you think about it in the long term, where do things end if you have arms races plus improving technology, which is exactly what we've had for a very long period of time? You can't rely upon nuclear or any other kind of deterrence lasting for decades or centuries. Even just for the few decades we've had nuclear weapons, we've had at least a dozen nuclear near misses. And some of these, yeah, and some of them were sheer dumb luck that we did not have a thermonuclear holocaust. But despite that, what gives me hope is the fact that democracy is our default condition, that we did come from fairly globalized, fluid roots, and that most people are pretty good. And as you mentioned, 99% of us do have shared interests, and 99% of us are not psychopaths. And in many ways, it's just about encouraging and using governance systems that bring out the best of us rather than the worst. And I'm entirely confident we can do that. Whether we do is a probabilistic question that becomes much more tricky, but I'm entirely confident we can. And most importantly, I'm actually quite happy that we live in a world where saving the world and making it a better place are the same thing. Making a safer world is also making a more just one. And we're pretty lucky to live in a world like that. I'd actually hate to be in a world which I think some people envision where, in order to be safe, in order to avoid the very worst threats, we need to have mass surveillance, we need to have autocrats, we need to have strongmen leaders. That is, as I've learned, complete and utter bullshit. It's quite the opposite. But it's good to be in a world where having a safer world means having a more democratic one, having a more just one, having a better one. And for all those reasons, yeah, I do tend to be pretty happy despite the grim topics I work on.
Yeah, yeah, me too, very much so. I mean, there's what's the alternative? I mean, you
That's true.
can't be doom laden all the time. Well, Luke, thank you very much. It's really been nice talking to you, and again, congratulations on the book. And are you working on a new book now, by the way? Are you just going to chill for a while?
I will be probably finishing up talking about this book for the next month or so, and thereafter I'll be starting a new book on the history and future of mass surveillance. And
Oh, wow, good.
yeah, as you know, in Goliath's Curse, I talk about different paths going forward, one being self-termination, global cyber collapse, another being democratic reform, slaying Goliath, and the most likely, I think, of the short term is what I refer to as Silicon Goliath. Essentially, a world in which we don't necessarily have collapse, but we do have continued democratic backsliding and AI-enabled mass surveillance states. And I think that is almost certainly going to happen. We see it already happening in the case of the UK. And already today, there is for every 10 UK citizens, one CCTV camera. And that's increasing, and we're already trying to roll out facial recognition across the entire country. And that's just the UK. It gets worse in other countries as well. But essentially, I see mass surveillance as being one of the biggest hurdles to actually having these more democratic futures. In particular, it's probably going to require things like civil disobedience and protest. And it's very difficult to have that if you have an autocratic state with incredible powers of mass surveillance. So to me, this is potentially the biggest short-term challenge we face, and that'll be the topic of my next book.
Excellent. Well, if you can, try not to take 7 years before it comes out.
I'll
For
I'll
your
do my
own
best.
sanity and for many readers across the world. So, but that'll be really fascinating, and I'm sure even, I mean, maybe even more depressing because it's already upon us. Really, I mean, there's no place where we're not being surveilled these days, and
Yeah,
China is the leader, and the U.S. is coming in a quick second, and the UK is roaring forwards. Everywhere is. I mean, this very apparatus on which both of us are speaking now is subject to some form of surveillance. So, it's all
precisely.
around us all the time. And, we did it all for a free email address. We all
Worth it.
we all became willing participants. And that's kind of the scariest thing of it all when history is written
Yeah,
about it. It's like, and you all volunteered to become the
yeah.
guinea pigs of it all. So,
Convenience
Luke,
is a
thank you
powerful
again
motivator.
so much. It was really excellent. And I hope we can speak again in a while and see how everything's going. And make sure you come by and have a visit if you come back to the land of Oz.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. And very keen to do in the future. And I'll make sure to get in touch next time I'm back in Australia.